They thought they were saving me, but they were actually confessing in open court. My parents smiled like they'd already won, right until Deputy Rodriguez began reading the asset list they'd just signed. Item 1 made my father freeze mid-breath. Item 2 left my mother clutching her chest. And by item 3, Judge Brennan slammed her gavel down hard enough to splinter the wood, screaming at everyone to stop immediately. My name is Jordan Hayes, and as I sat in that defendant's chair, I realized something. The silence before a detonation is always heavier than the explosion itself. But to understand how a daughter sits calmly while her family self-destructs, you need to understand how that family tried to destroy her first. 2 weeks ago, it started with a birthday dinner and a bill I refused to pay. The air inside the Gilded Horn smelled of brown butter, aged mahogany, and the specific cloying perfume of money desperate to be noticed. I arrived 6 minutes late, a cardinal sin in the Hayes household, one that usually warranted a lecture on the virtue of punctuality dressed up as concerned advice about my struggles with time management. But tonight, no one even looked up as I approached the curved leather booth. They were too busy admiring the centerpiece of their own little universe. My brother Brandon, flushed and loose-limbed from what I estimated to be his third scotch in 40 minutes. He wore a velvet blazer that I knew because I'd accidentally seen the credit card statement Catherine left open on her iPad last month, had been purchased on a card they shared. Catherine meaning our mother, though she preferred the formality of her full name in public settings, as if the extra syllables added gravitas. "You made it," Brandon announced, his voice carrying across the hushed dining room with the volume of someone who'd never been told to use his inside voice. He gestured with a tumbler of amber liquid that probably cost more than my monthly car insurance. "We were just discussing the IPO, you know, the big one. The venture capital guys are practically begging to get in on the ground floor." I pulled out the heavy oak chair across from him. The legs scraped against the floor, a sharp, grating sound that finally drew their attention. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me with varying degrees of acknowledgement. Brandon's glassy and unfocused, Madison's, his wife, coolly appraising, and my parents registering my presence with the enthusiasm one might show a piece of furniture being moved back into place. "Jordan," my father said, his tone measured and pastoral. William Hayes, Bill to his congregation, Reverend to the broader community, and Father, spoken with careful enunciation in our family, had perfected that voice over 30 years in the pulpit. It was the voice of a man who spoke on behalf of divine authority and expected compliance accordingly. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten." "Traffic on the bridge," I said, unfolding the linen napkin and placing it across my lap. It was a lie. I'd sat in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes, gathering the courage to walk through those brass-handled doors. Catherine, my mother, made a small sound of acknowledgement that could have meant anything. She was examining her reflection in the back of a polished spoon, smoothing an eyebrow that didn't need smoothing. "Well, you're here now. Brandon was just telling us about his latest venture." There was no IPO. There were no venture capital guys. I knew this because 3 months ago, Brandon had called me at 11 p.m., slurring about a temporary liquidity issue, asking if I could spot him $40,000. When I'd asked what for, he'd said something about cryptocurrency futures and an algorithm that couldn't fail. I'd said no. He'd hung up without saying goodbye. But watching them now, Brandon gesturing expansively, Bill nodding with paternal pride, Catherine beaming as if her firstborn had just announced he'd cured cancer, I realized that the performance was more important than the truth. They didn't want reality. They wanted the theater of success. "And what about you, Jordan?" Madison asked. She still hadn't looked directly at me. She was signaling the waiter for another bottle of wine, her hand moving with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been told no. "Still doing that little calculator job? What is it again? Tax prep?" The words hit exactly where she'd aimed them. "Forensic auditing," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm a forensic auditor with Caldwell and Finch. I just wrapped a 6-month investigation into procurement fraud. We uncovered a scheme where the CFO was funneling—" "Sounds dry," Brandon interrupted, waving his hand as if physically batting away my words. Numbers are fine for, you know, background work. But you lack the soul of business, Geordie. You need to understand the art of the deal. That's where real legacy gets built. Right, Dad? Your brother has a point, Bill said, his voice taking on that resonant quality that made people lean forward in church pews. It was the voice he used when about to ask for a second offering. Details are necessary, of course. Someone has to count the beans. But vision? Vision is a gift from God. It separates the leaders from the support staff. I closed my menu without looking at it. The rejection was swift and absolute, delivered with the surgical precision of people who'd had decades of practice. My reality, my actual tangible success, was nothing but background noise to them. White noise to drown out while they waited for their turn to speak. The new bottle of wine arrived. The waiter, a young man with the careful posture of someone working for tips, began to pour it into fresh glasses around the table. Madison snapped her fingers. Not figuratively. She actually snapped her fingers at me. Jordan, be a dear and pour the wine, she said, sliding the bottle toward me before the waiter could finish. He's busy with other tables, and you're closer. Try not to spill it. It's a 2015 vintage. I doubt you've had much experience with it. I looked at the bottle. I looked at Madison. For one brief, crystalline moment, I considered pouring it directly into her lap and watching that cream-colored silk dress absorb $800 worth of Bordeaux. But I didn't. I was trained to be professional, trained to de-escalate, trained by this very family to be useful and quiet and accommodating. So I picked up the bottle. It was heavy, cool to the touch, the label slightly damp from condensation. I poured a measure into Madison's glass, then Brandon's, then my parents'. The wine caught the candlelight, deep red and viscous. When I reached for my own glass, Madison cleared her throat. Oh, don't waste it on yourself, Jordan, she said with a light, tinkling laugh that had no warmth in it. You're driving, aren't you? Besides, this is a celebration for the successful members of the table. My hand hovered over my glass for a beat too long. Then I set the bottle down. Water's fine, I said. No one contradicted her. Bill and Catherine said nothing. Brandon had already turned his attention back to his phone, thumb scrolling through something that made him smile. The waiter returned to take our orders. Brandon ordered the tomahawk ribeye, 30 ounces of meat that arrived on a wooden board with fanfare. Catherine chose the lobster thermidor, already wrinkling her nose as she mentioned concerns about the sauce. Bill went with the rack of lamb. Madison added sides, truffle mac and cheese, asparagus with hollandaise, potatoes au gratin. When the waiter turned to me, I ordered the roasted chicken, the cheapest entree on the menu at $24, and asked for tap water. Tap water? Madison repeated, as if I'd asked for a bowl of dishwater. Tap water, I confirmed. The meal stretched across 2 hours like a slow-motion car accident. I watched them consume, and that was the only word for it. They didn't just eat, they consumed. Brandon devoured half his steak and abandoned the rest to congeal on the board. Catherine picked at her lobster with surgical precision, complaining about the sauce's consistency. Bill methodically worked through his lamb, using his knife and fork with the measured grace of a man accustomed to performing in front of an audience. And Madison held court. She spoke about private schools she was considering for children she didn't yet have. She name-dropped boarding schools in Connecticut, summer programs in Switzerland, the importance of cultivating the right circles early. Every few minutes her gaze would slide toward me when she mentioned good breeding or genetic legacy, as if to emphasize that I was somehow the recessive trait in the Hayes family genome. It's all about connections, Madison said, leaning back and swirling her third glass of wine. My father always said you can tell a person's worth by the company they keep. That's why Brandon and I fit so well together. We understand the burden of prestige. Absolutely, Brandon agreed, his words slightly slurred. We're going to build an empire, Maddie. Just you wait. Once this funding hits, we're buying that estate in the hills, the one with the vineyard. I saw it then, just a flicker. Bill's jaw tightened, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second. His eyes never left his plate, but his shoulders went rigid in that particular way that meant he was calculating, reassessing, preparing to manage a narrative. He knew. He knew there was no funding. He knew about the debts piling up behind Brandon's velvet blazer and Madison's Cartier bracelet. But he smiled anyway, because the alternative was admitting his golden sun was made of pyrite. The waiter cleared our plates. The table fell into an expectant silence. Then the bill arrived. It came in a black leather folder, placed discreetly in the center of the table by the same waiter who now looked relieved to be nearing the end of his interaction with us. The folder sat there like a small black hole, bending the space around it. No one reached for it. Brandon patted the breast pocket of his blazer. "Ah, wallet's in the other coat," he muttered. It was the same line I'd heard at his 25th, 26th, and 27th birthday dinners. Bill suddenly became fascinated by the chandelier overhead. "I believe I left my reading glasses in the car," he announced to no one in particular. "Can't make out the numbers." Catherine was busy reapplying her lipstick using a small compact mirror, having apparently dissociated completely from the reality of commerce. Madison sighed, a long theatrical sound. She reached across the table with one manicured hand and flipped the folder open. Her eyes scanned the bottom line. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just looked up and locked eyes with me. $6,418, she announced. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gun. $6,000. That was 3 months of rent for a normal person. That was a used car. That was a significant chunk of student loan principal. Madison slid the folder across the white tablecloth until it stopped against my water glass. "Happy birthday, Brandon," she said, her smile sharp as a scalpel. I stared at the black leather. The candlelight flickered across its surface, making the embossed logo of the gilded horn shimmer like it was underwater. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What is this?" "It's the bill, Jordan." Madison's voice had taken on that careful, patronizing tone people use when explaining something to a child. "Since Brandon is the guest of honor and your parents have given so much to raise us all, it falls to the sibling with the steady, boring job to handle the logistics." "Handle the logistics," I repeated. "Consider it your contribution to the family," Catherine added, snapping her compact shut. "We know you don't have much of a social life, dear, so you must have savings piling up." I opened the folder. 4 bottles of wine at $400 each, the tomahawk steak, the lobster, the appetizers I hadn't been offered, the sides I hadn't eaten, the desserts they'd ordered while I'd excused myself to the bathroom. And there, at the bottom of the itemized list, my $24 chicken entree. Something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a pattern you've been trying not to see suddenly resolves into perfect focus. "I'm not paying this," I said. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to dim. Brandon stopped mid-sip. Catherine's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Madison's smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes narrowed. "Come on, Jordy." Brandon leaned forward, his voice dropping into what he probably thought was a reasonable register. "Don't be like that. It's my big day. We're celebrating." "I'm not paying $6,000 for a dinner I didn't order, for wine I wasn't allowed to drink, and for a celebration of an achievement that doesn't exist." I reached into my purse. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping my voice level. I pulled out 3 $20 bills from my wallet and placed them on top of the bill. "Here's $60, I said. "That covers my chicken, my tax, and a generous tip for the server who had to put up with you snapping your fingers at him, Madison. The rest of you can figure out how to pay for what you ordered." "You're joking." Madison's voice went up half an octave. "You're going to embarrass us over a few $1,000s? You earn more than this in a week, Jordan. Don't be ridiculous." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Catherine's voice trembled with indignation. She pressed her hand to her chest as if I'd physically struck her. "After everything we've sacrificed for this family's image, you would leave your brother with a debt like this? On his birthday?" "He ordered it, Mom," I said, standing up. The chair scraped loud against the floor. "He can pay for it, or you can. You're the ones who insist he's a tycoon with venture capital guys lining up." Madison leaned forward, and her carefully constructed elegance cracked down the middle. Her face twisted into something ugly and raw. "You know what you are, Jordan?" Her voice was low. Venomous. You're tragic. You have a little bit of money and absolutely no class. You think hoarding your pennies makes you safe? It just makes you alone. You've forgotten your duty to your blood. I looked at each of them in turn. Really looked. Bill, refusing to make eye contact, studying the chandelier as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Catherine, staring at me with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. Brandon, sulking like a child denied a toy. And Madison, conductor of this symphony of greed, her mask finally slipped enough to show the contempt underneath. My duty, I said quietly, is to myself. Enjoy the coffee. I hear it's $12 a cup. I turned and walked toward the exit. The distance from this booth to the heavy glass doors felt like miles. I could feel the stares from other tables, could sense the servers pausing mid-step to watch the drama unfold. My face burned, but I kept my spine straight and my pace measured. Don't run. Don't give them the satisfaction. The cold night air hit my face like a slap when I pushed through the doors. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing hard, my breath forming small clouds in the October chill of Harborstone. I didn't go to the valet stand. I walked 3 blocks down the street to where I'd parked my sedan under a flickering streetlight. I'd avoided the $20 valet fee, a small irony that now felt prophetic. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors behind me. The silence inside my car was profound. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, breathing in the familiar scent of old upholstery and vanilla air freshener. My phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark and blessedly quiet. Then it buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, each vibration sharp as a wasp's sting. I picked it up, already knowing what I'd find. Text from Bill. 8:42 p.m. You have humiliated this family for the last time. To walk out on your brother, to disrespect Madison. You've forgotten your place, daughter. We will not be made fools of. You will fix this, or so help me God, we will bring you to your knees. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen. They hadn't even waited 5 minutes. They were probably still sitting there, ordering dessert, calculating how to cover the bill, deciding that I was the villain of this story. Bring me to my knees, I whispered, testing the words. It wasn't concern for my well-being. It wasn't an attempt to understand why I was upset. It was a threat, a declaration of war dressed up in parental authority. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. For years, God, for years, I'd thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I gave enough, if I stayed quiet enough, they would eventually see me. If I became the stable one, the successful one, the competent one, surely they would be proud. But tonight, the illusion shattered like cheap glass. They didn't want me successful. They wanted me useful. There's a difference. And now that I'd refused to be useful, I'd become something else entirely. I'd become an enemy. This wasn't just a bad dinner. This wasn't a family squabble that would blow over after some apologetic phone calls and an awkward Christmas. As I merged onto the highway, leaving the lights of downtown Harborstone behind me, I understood what this actually was. This was an act of war. And if they wanted a war with a forensic auditor, someone who spent 50 hours a week finding the things people desperately tried to hide, they had made a critical strategic error. They assumed I was just a daughter. They forgot I was also the person who'd exposed a CFO's embezzlement scheme so complex it took 3 federal prosecutors to understand it. I didn't drive home. I didn't want to be in my apartment, the one they had keys to, the one where they felt entitled to show up unannounced. I needed neutral ground. I needed a fortress. I drove straight to the Caldwell and Finch building. The security guard, Mike, who'd worked the graveyard shift for as long as I'd been with the firm, looked surprised when I pulled up to the gate. "Ms. Hayes, working late?" "Need to catch up on some files," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. He waved me through. My parking spot was empty, waiting. The elevator ride to the 24th floor was silent, except for the mechanical hum of cables and gears. The corridor lights were motion-activated, flickering on as I walked, creating a path of illumination through the darkness. My office was exactly as I'd left it, neat, organized, everything in its place. I sat down at my desk and turned on my computer. The monitors glowed to life, casting blue light across the room. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking anymore. I felt cold, precise. I opened a new file folder on my desktop. Named it Project Haze. If Bill wanted to talk about humiliation, I would show him what the word actually meant. I would map every dollar, every lie, every fake investment, every stolen cent. I would trace the lines of credit in the shell companies. I would find every place they'd hidden money they shouldn't have, every transaction that didn't quite add up. I typed the first entry into a new spreadsheet. Incident 1, attempted coercion of funds. Location, the Gilded Horn, Harborstone. Amount, $6,418. I sat back and looked at the blinking cursor. Okay, Dad, I said to the empty office. Let's see who ends up on their knees. The electronic chirp of my smart lock disengaging cut through the silence of my apartment like a knife. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. It was 7 a.m. on a Saturday. The morning sun was just starting to filter through my windows, casting long rectangles of light across the hardwood floors. I was wearing sweatpants and an old Caldwell and Finch company t-shirt, my hair pulled into a messy knot on top of my head. I'd turned off my phone the night before. I'd needed the silence, needed a few hours where I didn't belong to anyone, where I was just Jordan. But the beep of the lock, that specific 4-tone sequence that meant someone had used an authorized key card, sent adrenaline spiking through my bloodstream. I set down the mug and stood up, my mind racing through possibilities. Maintenance worker? No, not without notice. Someone from building management? They would have called. Then the door swung open. Brandon walked in first. Behind him, Bill and Catherine. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They simply breached my home like it was public property. We need to talk, Bill announced. No greeting. No apology for the intrusion. He was wearing what he called his casual clothes, a polo shirt and pressed khakis, but his posture was anything but casual. This was the stance of a man arriving for a hostile takeover. Behind him, Catherine clutched her purse with both hands, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet my eyes, instead fixating on a point somewhere past my left shoulder. And Brandon. Brandon looked like death. His skin had a grayish tint. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles. His hands trembled as he walked straight past me to my kitchen island and leaned against it, hanging his head like a man awaiting execution. Get out, I said. My voice came out calmer than I felt. You don't walk into my home uninvited, not after last night. Sit down, Jordan. Bill's voice had that particular timbre, the one he used when he expected immediate obedience, when questioning him would be tantamount to questioning divine will itself. I'm not sitting until you explain why you're breaking and entering. Bill reached into a leather portfolio he was carrying. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and tossed them onto my coffee table. The papers hit the glass with a heavy slap that made me flinch. Your brother, Bill said, gesturing vaguely at Brandon's miserable form, has made some errors in judgment. Significant errors. I'm shocked, I said dryly. He owes money, Catherine whispered. Finally, she looked up and I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear for me, fear of what was coming. Jordan, they're going to hurt him. These are bad people, not banks, private lenders. I looked at Brandon. He still wouldn't raise his head. How much? I asked. Brandon didn't answer. He just stared at my granite countertop as if it might open up and swallow him. Look at me, I said, my voice sharpening. How much, Brandon? $720,000, Bill answered for him. The number landed like a physical blow. 720,000. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't a bad credit card bill. That was a life sentence. Gambling? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Investments, Brandon croaked. High-yield crypto futures. There was an algorithm, Jordan. It was supposed to... It's gone. I cut him off. The money's gone. And now the sharks want their pound of flesh back. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the documents. I'm a forensic auditor. Reading contracts is what I do. I scanned the first page and my stomach dropped. It was a predatory lending agreement from a shadow firm, the kind that charges interest rates that border on illegal. But attached to it was a second document, a mortgage refinancing agreement. I read the address listed on the property, Unit 402, Skyline Avenue, my apartment. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, looking up at Bill. "We've spoken to a specialist," Bill said, his tone perfectly even, as if we were discussing a church budget instead of my home. "We can restructure the debt, but we need collateral, significant collateral. Your mother and my house is already leveraged. Brandon has no assets in his name. You're the only one with equity." The words hung in the air. "You want me to mortgage my home?" My voice climbed despite my efforts to control it. "You want me to take out a loan against the only thing I own to pay off a gambling debt for a 35-year-old man?" "It's a bridge loan," Catherine pleaded, stepping forward. "Just for a year. Brandon has a new project starting in the fall. He'll make the monthly payments. We just need your signature to secure the principal." "Brandon can't even pay for his own steak dinner," I said. "What makes you think he's going to pay a mortgage on a $700,000 high-risk loan?" I dropped the papers back onto the table. "Does Madison know?" I asked. Brandon's head snapped up. Panic flooded his face. Raw, animalistic panic. "No," he said quickly. "You can't tell her. She'll leave me, Jordan. She'll take everything. She thinks..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "She thinks you're liquid because you lie to her," I said. "You're drowning, Brandon. And now you want to grab my ankles and pull me down with you so you can keep playing pretend." "It's not pulling you down," Bill said, stepping between me and Brandon. "It's saving your brother's life. If he doesn't pay within 72 hours, there will be consequences. Physical consequences." "Then go to the police." "We can't go to the police." Bill's voice rose, an actual shout that made Catherine flinch. "Think of the church. Think of my standing in the community. If it gets out that my son is involved with loan sharks, we're finished. The scandal would destroy everything I've built." "So I have to pay for your reputation?" I asked. "I have to lose my home so you can keep your standing?" "You won't lose it," Bill insisted. "We'll handle it. We just need the equity. You're the strong one, Jordan. You've always been the strong one. God has blessed you with stability so that you can aid us in times of trial." I looked at them, really looked at all three of them. Bill, standing there in his expensive casual clothes, making demands wrapped in biblical language. Catherine, tears in her eyes, but not for me, for the scandal, for the image. Brandon, a 35-year-old child who'd never been told no in his life, who'd gambled away $750,000 and expected his little sister to fix it. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding a sacrifice. They saw my success not as my achievement, but as a resource they were entitled to harvest. "No," I said. The room went silent. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed to fade away. "Excuse me?" Bill's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "No," I repeated. "I will not sign. I will not mortgage my home. I will not enable this anymore. If Brandon is in trouble, he needs to face it. He needs to tell his wife. He needs to file for bankruptcy or go to the authorities. But I am not lighting myself on fire to keep you warm." Bill stared at me. The mask of the concerned father vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. A look I'd seen him use on deacons who questioned his decisions, on congregation members who didn't tithe enough. "You're being selfish," he said flatly, "just like last night." "I'm being sane," I countered. "Now get out of my apartment. Leave the keycard on the counter." Brandon looked like he was about to vomit. Catherine was sobbing openly now, pressing her handkerchief to her face. But Bill didn't move. He took a step closer to me. "You think this is a request, Jordan?" His voice was soft now, which somehow made it more threatening. "You think you have a choice? You're a part of this family whether you like it or not." He leaned in, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Expensive, cloying. "You're clearly unwell. You're making irrational decisions. First the scene at the restaurant, now abandoning your brother to violence. This isn't the behavior of a stable woman. I'm perfectly stable, I said, pointing to the door. Leave. If you won't do this voluntarily, Bill said, his voice void of any emotion now, we'll make you do it. We'll take the choice out of your hands for your own good. Is that a threat? It's a promise of salvation, he said. He grabbed Catherine by the arm. Come, your daughter needs time to think. He looked at Brandon. Get the key card. Brandon hesitated. For just a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Regret? Shame? But then it passed. He pulled the key card from his wallet and placed it on the marble island with a soft plastic click. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading, before he followed our parents to the door. When the lock beeped shut behind them, I sank onto the sofa. I was shaking, not from fear, from rage, from the sheer audacity of it all. I'd thought I had won last night. I'd thought walking away was taking a stand. I was wrong. I hadn't won anything. I'd just triggered the nuclear option. 48 hours later, I walked into the lobby of the Caldwell and Finch building, holding my morning latte in one hand and my ID badge in the other. It was Tuesday, 7:30 a.m., and I was running on 4 hours of sleep and pure spite. I'd changed my locks. I'd called building management and had Brandon's name removed from the authorized guest list. I'd gone to work, buried myself in spreadsheets, tried to convince myself that Bill was bluffing. He wouldn't actually do anything that required a public legal battle, I reasoned. He was a man of image. The last thing he wanted was attention. I was wrong about that, too. I approached the security turnstiles, the glass gates that separated the public lobby from the corporate elevators. I tapped my badge against the reader the way I had 1,000 times before. Instead of the cheerful green light and mechanical click of the gate opening, the reader flashed harsh red. A low, dissonant buzz sounded. I frowned and tapped it again. Red light, buzz. Must be demagnetized, I muttered, walking over to the security desk. Mike was sitting there, but he wasn't doing his usual morning routine, greeting people, making small talk about the weather. He was staring intensely at his monitor, his jaw tight. Hey, Mike, I said. My badge is acting up. Can you buzz me through? Mike looked up slowly. He looked uncomfortable. He looked guilty. I can't do that, Ms. Hayes, he said quietly. What do you mean? It's just a glitch. It's not a glitch. He lowered his voice further. Your credentials have been revoked. HR sent down a flag this morning. Access denied. Indefinite suspension pending investigation. My blood ran cold. Investigation into what? Before Mike could answer, a man in a cheap gray suit stepped out from behind a pillar near the elevators. He wasn't building security. He wasn't a client. He held a large manila envelope in his hand. Jordan Hayes? He asked. I turned to face him. Yes? You've been served, he said, thrusting the envelope into my hands. He turned and walked away before I could even process what was happening. I stood there in the lobby, people streaming past me on their way to work, the envelope heavy in my hands like a brick. I ripped it open. The header at the top of the first page made my heart stop. Superior Court of Harbor County Emergency Ex Parte Order for Temporary Conservatorship. I read the words, but my brain refused to translate them. Conservatorship. That was for elderly people with dementia. That was for people in comas. That was for... I flipped to the second page. A sworn affidavit from Dr. Richard Caldwell. I'd never met a Dr. Caldwell in my life. Yet here was his signature, below a paragraph stating that he had reviewed the case history and found evidence of acute paranoid delusions, polysubstance abuse, and a history of erratic, self-destructive financial behavior. They had weaponized the dinner. The affidavit cited my public outburst at the Gilded Horn, my irrational hostility toward family members, and my disappearance afterward as proof of a mental break. I flipped the page. Petitioners William and Catherine Hayes. They were asking for emergency control over my person and my estate to prevent imminent harm. And at the bottom, in elegant script, Judge Patricia Brennan had signed it, a temporary order granted ex parte, meaning they didn't even have to tell me they were doing it until it was done. My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the papers. I reached for my phone. I needed to call my bank. I needed to move my money before they could touch it. I dialed the priority client line. "Welcome to First National," the automated voice said. "Please enter your access PIN." I entered it with trembling fingers. "We're sorry. Your access to this account has been suspended due to a pending legal order. Please contact your branch administrator." I hung up and tried my credit card app. Login failed, account frozen. I tried my work email, password incorrect. I stood in the middle of the lobby, people brushing past me, the cold air conditioning blasting down from the vents above. I felt naked. I felt erased. In the span of a single morning, they had stripped me of my job, my money, and my legal autonomy. Bill wasn't trying to convince me to pay the debt anymore. He'd realized that asking me was too difficult, that as long as I had the power to say no, I would always be a problem. So he'd taken away my voice. They didn't just want the $720,000 to pay off the loan shark. They wanted the apartment. They wanted the retirement fund. They wanted everything. They wanted total dominion. I looked at the signature on the affidavit again. Dr. Richard Caldwell, a man who had diagnosed me without ever seeing my face. I put the papers back in the envelope. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The shock was receding, replaced by that cold, sharp clarity I'd felt in my car 2 nights ago. They thought they'd checkmated me. They thought by taking my resources, they'd taken my ability to fight. I walked out of the building. The morning air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. I had $12 cash in my wallet and a full tank of gas in my car. I was technically homeless, legally incompetent, and financially destitute. But as I walked to the parking garage, I remembered something they had forgotten to seize. They'd frozen the bank accounts they knew about. They'd locked the doors they had keys to. But a good auditor always keeps a backup file, and a smart woman always keeps a rainy day fund that doesn't appear on a credit report. I got into my car and looked at the courthouse address on the paperwork. "Okay," I said aloud, starting the engine. "You want to play with the law? Let's see how you like it when the law reads the fine print." I wasn't going to run. I was going to war. But first, I had to disappear. The Starlight Motel sat off Interstate 94 like a forgotten relic, its neon sign buzzing with dying voltage. The place advertised hourly rates on a sun-faded placard, and the carpet in my room smelled of cigarettes and industrial bleach. But it had 3 things I needed: cash payment accepted, no ID required, and functioning Wi-Fi. I sat at the particle board desk, my burner laptop, a heavy, outdated machine I'd kept in my storage unit for exactly this kind of emergency, humming to life. Through the thin curtains, headlights from the highway painted moving shadows across the walls. I'd retrieved my burn bag from the storage facility that afternoon. $5,000 in small bills, withdrawn slowly over 5 years, a practice I'd adopted after investigating a cartel money trail that had turned violent. The senior partner at Caldwell and Finch had told me, "Always have an exit strategy that doesn't involve a bank." Now that advice felt prophetic. But $5,000 wouldn't last long. I needed leverage, I needed information, and I knew exactly where to find it. When I'd bought my apartment 3 years ago, I hadn't trusted the contractor's default smart home setup. Too many security vulnerabilities, too many back doors the manufacturer could access, so I'd wiped the system clean and installed my own server, creating a localized network with military-grade encryption. I'd also hard-coded a root administrator access point that didn't appear in any user interface, a ghost key that only someone with my specific knowledge of the system architecture could find. Bill and Brandon had undoubtedly changed all the passwords, locked me out of the main controls. They probably felt very secure. They had no idea I could walk through the walls. I opened a terminal window and typed in the command string I'd memorized, SSH root at 192.168.1.1-P8022. The cursor blinked. Then, connecting to host 402_Skyline. Status, online, bypassing user interface. Access granted. The screen filled with options. Camera feeds, audio sensors, environmental controls, door logs. Everything was still there, running in the background while they played house in my home. I clicked on the living room camera feed. The image resolved in crisp high definition. My apartment. Except it wasn't mine anymore. Madison was walking across the frame, and she was wearing stiletto boots, muddy stiletto boots, walking directly across my white Moroccan wool rug, the one I'd saved for 6 months to buy, the one I'd had shipped from Marrakesh. Each step left a dark smear. Of course, I whispered to the empty motel room. Madison stopped in the middle of the living room, hands on her hips, surveying the space like a general planning a conquest. Then she turned toward what I assumed was Brandon, just off camera. "I hate this color," her voice came through the laptop speakers, tinny but clear. "It's so sterile. We'll have to repaint before we list it." List it? They weren't just using my apartment as collateral. They were planning to sell it. "Can't list it yet, Maddie." Brandon walked into frame, holding a bottle of wine. My wine, a 2016 Cabernet I'd been saving for a celebration. He wasn't using a glass. He was drinking straight from the bottle, his movements jittery and unfocused. "Dad says we have to wait for the permanent hearing. If we sell too fast, the judge might get suspicious." "I'm not waiting 6 months, Brandon." Madison's voice took on a sharp edge. "You said there was equity here. I want my cut. My family's asking questions about where the money for the expansion is coming from." The door opened and Bill walked in, Catherine trailing behind him. They didn't look like the heartbroken parents from the courtroom paperwork. They looked like property managers doing a walkthrough before an eviction. Bill was carrying a clipboard, making notes with the mechanical precision of someone cataloging assets. "Keep your voices down," Bill commanded without looking up. "The neighbors have ears. We're here to secure assets for Jordan's medical care. That's the narrative. Do not deviate." "She's not even here, Dad," Brandon muttered, taking another pull from my bottle. "She's gone, probably sleeping under a bridge somewhere." "She's a loose end," Bill said sharply, finally looking up from his clipboard. "Walsh says she hasn't used her credit cards. That means she has cash somewhere. A rat with food is a rat that survives. We need her desperate." I sat back in the cheap motel chair, my hands curled into fists. They weren't worried about me. They were strategizing about me, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be concerned about. I watched them for another hour. Catherine went through my closet, commenting on how dated my professional wardrobe was. Bill photographed my bookshelf, probably for the estate inventory. Brandon passed out on my couch with the empty wine bottle on his chest. But watching wasn't enough. I needed to see what they were doing, not just what they were saying. I opened a second terminal window and typed another command, this one accessing the remote desktop mirror I'd installed on my personal computer 3 years ago. It was a tool I used for security testing, a keystroke logger and screen recorder that activated only when I enabled it manually. I enabled it now. The system showed no activity. My desktop computer was asleep. I waited. At 11:17 p.m., the activity log spiked. Someone had woken up my computer. I activated the screen mirror. The login screen appeared. Someone was typing my password. They got it wrong twice. On the third try, they entered, Cooper, 2019, the name of our childhood dog. The desktop loaded. I saw my familiar wallpaper, a minimalist photo of the Harborstone skyline at sunset. Then a browser window opened. Maltagaming.io, an offshore gambling site I recognized from my research into Brandon's debt. Username, GoldenBoy888. Balance, minus $4,200. Brandon was gambling, on my computer, using my internet connection. Even now, even after everything, he was still placing bets. I watched him lose $200 on a horse race in Hong Kong, then another $300 on a soccer match in Brazil. "You're digging the hole deeper," I whispered. But then he closed the browser and did something unexpected. He opened Excel and plugged in a USB drive. The file that loaded was titled budget_2825_final.xlsx. It looked boring. Domestic, just a standard household budget spreadsheet. But as Brandon scrolled through the rows, I recognized the structure. This wasn't a budget. This was a ledger. The columns were labeled innocuously: date, vendor, amount, category. But the amounts were too consistent, too deliberate. $9,000, $9,500, $9,750. Always just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic bank reporting requirements. The vendor names: Omega Consulting, Trinity Services, Blue Harbor Logistics. I opened a second window and ran a quick corporate registry search. All three companies were registered to the same P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware, and they had the same registered agent, a corporate services firm that specialized in creating shell companies for privacy-conscious clients. I scrolled back to the Excel sheet on Brandon's screen. He was highlighting entries and copy-pasting them into a new sheet. Then I saw the source column. Source: G. Hayes, Pastoral Discretionary Fund. My father's discretionary fund, the money the church gave him to use for emergency pastoral care and community outreach. The fund that was supposed to help families facing eviction, buy groceries for single mothers, pay utility bills for the elderly. Bill was siphoning it, thousands of dollars at a time, structured to avoid detection, funneled through shell companies that existed only on paper. And Brandon wasn't just the golden child failure. He was the mule, moving money from the church to the shell corps, taking a cut to pay his gambling debts while Bill kept his hands ostensibly clean. I took screenshots, every single page, every transaction. Brandon opened another tab in Excel. This one was a transfer form. Recipient: Pierce Heritage Holdings Pierce, Madison's maiden name. I watched him transfer $12,000 from Trinity Services to an account at a regional bank in Cincinnati. The routing number matched Ohio, Madison's real home state. I opened another search window, fingers flying across the keys. Pierce Heritage Holdings, incorporated 2 years ago. Registered agent: Madison Pierce. Asset value: negative $18,000. Status: multiple liens, collections active. There was no old money, no trust fund. The family estate Madison talked about was a rental property in a failing market, mortgaged to the hilt. Madison wasn't an heiress. She was a grifter who'd married Brandon thinking he was wealthy, while Brandon had married her thinking she was wealthy. They were two parasites trying to drain each other, slowly starving while they smiled for the cameras. And now they'd decided to feast on me. I watched Brandon make 3 more transfers. Click, click, click. Each one a separate count of wire fraud, moving stolen church money through shell companies to hide its origin. My finger hovered over the disconnect button. I could shut this down right now. Lock them out. Wipe the drive. Stop the bleeding. But I didn't. If I stopped them now, it was just a family dispute. Bill would claim it was an accounting error, a misunderstanding. He'd say I'd hacked the computer to plant evidence, that my paranoid delusions were manifesting in cybercrimes. I needed more. I needed a pattern. I needed them to feel safe enough to get sloppy. I set the keystroke logger to autosave every hour and upload encrypted copies to a server in Switzerland. I configured the system to capture screenshots anytime the Excel file opened. I wasn't just observing a crime scene, I was curating an exhibit. At 3 a.m., I was still awake, riding a wave of caffeine and cold fury. The motel's neon sign cast a pink glow through the thin curtains, and the couple in the next room had finally stopped their rhythmic argument with the headboard. I'd spent the last 4 hours pulling threads, and what I'd found wasn't just a loose hem. The entire tapestry was unraveling. I had the financial trail. I had evidence of Bill's embezzlement, but I needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. I needed to know who Madison really was. I opened my skip tracing software, a subscription service I maintained through a prepaid account specifically for cases where I needed to find people who didn't want to be found. The interface was clinical, empty fields waiting for data. I entered Madison's social security number, which I'd pulled from a joint tax return Brandon had foolishly saved on my desktop last year. The search took 30 seconds. Result: SSN belongs to Madison Lewis, not Madison Pierce. I clicked through to the full profile. Madison Elizabeth Lewis. D.O.B. March 14, 1992. Last known address: Dayton, Ohio. Employment history: Pyramid Properties. LLC. Real estate agent. License revoked. 2019. Reason: Co-mingling of escrow funds, failure to maintain proper accounting. Civil judgments, Highland Property Management versus Lewis. Eviction for non-payment, $18,000. Chase Bank versus Lewis. Credit card default, $31,000. BMW Financial Services versus Lewis. Vehicle repossession, 2019 criminal record, Franklin County, Ohio. Passing bad checks, 3 counts. Pled to misdemeanor, probation. The woman sleeping in my guest bedroom, the woman who'd sneered at my choice of wine and talked about good breeding, had been evicted, arrested, and professionally disbarred. I opened the court records for the eviction case and downloaded the booking photo from the check fraud arrest. 5 years younger, less makeup, hair in a messy ponytail instead of the expensive highlights she wore now. But the eyes were the same, calculating, hard, predatory. I traced the money further. The Pierce Heritage Fund that Brandon had been wiring money to wasn't a family trust. It was a checking account Madison had opened in Kentucky, a state with lax banking privacy laws, using her fake last name to create the illusion of legitimacy. The outflows from that account told a story. $8,500 to Midwestern Credit Solutions, debt collector in Columbus. $4,200 to luxury handbag resale, consignment shop. $15,000 to a cosmetic surgery clinic in Miami, $2,100 to Saks Fifth Avenue, the YSL bag from yesterday. She wasn't investing in anything. She was using stolen church money to pay off old debts and maintain the costume of wealth. It was a Ponzi scheme of lifestyle. They were stealing money to pay for the image that convinced people they didn't need to steal money. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my eyes. The pieces were falling into place. Now I understood why Bill and Catherine had embraced Madison so readily, despite her mysterious background. It wasn't because she had money. It was because she knew how to perform wealth. She was the perfect prop for Sunday morning sermons about prosperity and blessings. She validated their narrative that they were chosen people living chosen lives. They were all frauds, every single one of them. And they'd cannibalized my life to keep their show running for another season. I created a new folder on the encrypted drive, The Slaughter. I started dragging files, bank statements showing the flow from Pastoral Discretionary Fund to Shell Corps, Brandon's gambling logs with timestamps and IP addresses, Madison's real identity documents and criminal history. The property records showing the Pierce estate was actually in foreclosure. Screenshots of every transaction, every transfer, every lie. I wasn't just gathering information. I was building a weapon. But a weapon is useless if you don't know how to aim it. I looked at the conservatorship paperwork again. Bill had locked me in a legal cage. If I walked into court alone, waving these documents, Judge Brennan would look at Dr. Caldwell's affidavit, see paranoid delusions, and dismiss my evidence as conspiracy theories constructed by a sick mind. I needed someone who could speak the language of the court, someone who wasn't afraid of the church, someone who had their own reasons to want Bill destroyed. I closed my eyes and thought back 5 years. There'd been a small scandal, quickly buried. The church had a legal counsel, a brilliant strategist named Frank Morrison. He'd been a rising star in Harborstone, the kind of lawyer who won cases other firms wouldn't touch. Then suddenly, he was gone. The rumor mill said he had a drinking problem, that he'd embezzled from clients, that he'd had some kind of breakdown. He was disbarred, disgraced, erased from the community. But I knew Bill's playbook now. When Bill said someone else had a drinking problem, it meant they'd caught him drinking. When he said someone embezzled, it meant they'd discovered his embezzlement. If Bill had destroyed Frank Morrison, it was because Frank had found something Bill needed buried. I opened a new search tab. Frank Morrison, Harborstone. No LinkedIn, no law firm website, just a single business license registration. Morrison Archives and Research Address. 847 Blackstone Avenue, Historic District. I checked the time. 3:47 a.m. Too early to show up unannounced, even for someone living on the edge of society. I set an alarm for 6:30 a.m., lay down on the bed fully clothed, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 days, I slept dreamlessly. The historic district of Harborstone looked different in morning light. The brick buildings that seemed charming in tourism brochures revealed themselves as slowly crumbling relics, their windows dark or boarded, their storefronts empty except for fading for lease signs. 847. Blackstone was sandwiched between a laundromat and a defunct electronics store. The sign in the window was peeling, the gold letters barely legible. Morrison Archives and Research. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. "We're closed!" a voice shouted from inside. It was deep, gravelly, like it had been gargling razor blades. "I'm not a customer," I called back. "I'm a Hayes!" Silence, long enough that I thought he might have walked away. Then I heard the sound of 3 deadbolts sliding back, one after another. The door opened. Frank Morrison looked like he'd been carved from granite and left out in acid rain for a decade. He was unshaven, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better years and jeans with paint stains. But his eyes were sharp, terrifyingly sharp. "Hayes," he said, tasting the name like spoiled milk. "You've got 5 seconds to give me a reason not to slam this door in your face." "Bill stole my life," I said quickly. "And I have the spreadsheets to prove he did the same to you." Frank stared at me for a long moment. Then he stepped back and gestured for me to enter. The inside of the shop was a fortress of paper. Filing boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, creating narrow canyons between walls of documents. The air smelled of old newsprint and strong coffee. A single desk sat in the back corner, buried under maps, ledgers, and an ancient computer that hummed like it was preparing for takeoff. "I heard about the court order," Frank said, closing the door behind me and re-engaging the deadbolts. "Word travels fast in the gutter. They say you cracked. Drugs, paranoia, the usual Hayes playbook." "I didn't crack," I said, pulling the flash drive from my pocket. "I was set up because I refused to mortgage my apartment to pay off Brandon's gambling debts. And in the process, I found out where the church roof fund actually went." Frank's eyes narrowed. "The roof fund?" "It wasn't tiles," I said. "It was a shell company in Delaware called Shepherd's Flock, LLC. And now it's funding Madison's credit card bills and Brandon's bookies." I tossed the flash drive onto his desk. It landed with a small plastic click. "It's all there. Flow of funds, fake identities, judges' campaign donations laundered through the same system." Frank picked up the drive like it might be explosive. He walked to his computer and plugged it in. The machine wheezed to life, the monitor flickering. He clicked through the files in complete silence. 10 minutes passed. The only sound was the hum of the hard drive and his occasional grunt of recognition. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. He looked at me with a new expression, not pity, but something like respect. "This is nuclear," he said softly. "You've got enough here to put the whole family in federal prison. Racketeering, wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. 20 years minimum federal time." "I know," I said, "but I can't use it. Judge Brennan signed the conservatorship. If I try to submit this evidence, they'll seal it as part of my delusion. They'll bury it and bury me." Frank laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound that held no humor. "You want to fight a system that's already decided you're crazy?" He shook his head. "You can't win a competency hearing, Jordan. They have a doctor. They have a narrative. You walk in there screaming about fraud. You just prove their point." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Just let them win?" "No," Frank said, standing up. He walked to a whiteboard covered in dust and wiped a clean spot with his sleeve. "You don't fight the conservatorship." He picked up a marker. "You embrace it." I frowned. "Excuse me?" "Think about it," Frank said, drawing a circle on the board. "What do they want?" "Control. Assets." "Right. They're greedy. And greed is a form of blindness." He drew arrows pointing into the circle. "Right now, they're fighting to take responsibility for you. They're petitioning the court to legally assume all your rights and all your obligations." He turned to face me. "They think they're inheriting a bank account. But what if we made them inherit more than that?" "I don't have liabilities," I said. "I have 0 debt." "Technically true," Frank said, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. "But you're an auditor. You can create structures. What if we structured your cooperation in a way that forces them to sign off on things they haven't bothered to read? He began to pace, energy building in his voice. We don't fight the order. We call Walsh, their lawyer. We tell him you're broken. You're ready to surrender. You want to sign a voluntary transfer of all assets to end the conflict. Why would I do that? Because, Frank said, in the voluntary transfer agreement, the one we will draft, we include a detailed inventory. An inventory that lists your apartment, your savings, and— He paused for effect. Certain other items. What other items? The evidence, Frank said. We list the shell companies. We list the tax liabilities associated with the laundered money. We list the obligation to report the illegal transfers found on your computer. We attach the entire fraud scheme as a set of contingent liabilities belonging to the estate. I stared at him, my mind racing. They won't read it, I said slowly. Bill never reads fine print. He just signs where the lawyer tells him. Exactly, Frank said. And Walsh is lazy. He thinks he's already won. If you offer to hand over the keys without a fight, they'll rush to sign before the judge changes her mind. They'll be so eager to grab the gold, they won't notice the grenade attached to it. And once they sign it, I trailed off. Once they sign it and it's filed with the court, Frank finished, it becomes a matter of public record. They will have legally acknowledged, under penalty of perjury, that they are the custodians of the shell companies and the fraudulent accounts. They'll have signed a confession thinking it was a receipt. I walked to the whiteboard. It was brilliant. It was vicious. It was exactly the kind of trap Bill would walk into because his arrogance wouldn't allow him to see a victim fighting back. I need you to draft the agreement, I said. I can provide the data, but I don't know the legal phrasing to make it stick. I'm disbarred, Frank reminded me. I can't represent you in court. I don't need you in court, I said. I need you to be the architect. I'll walk in there alone. I'll play the broken daughter. I just need the paper to be lethal. Frank looked at the flash drive still plugged into his computer. He looked at the files. Years of his life that Bill had stolen. His reputation destroyed. His career ended because he'd asked too many questions about church finances. I'll write it, Frank said quietly. We'll make it look like a standard asset transfer. We'll bury the poison deep in the appendices. By the time they realize what they've swallowed, they'll be dead on the floor. Guillaume, 5 days later, I stood in my own apartment, legally barred from entering it, but there I was, nonetheless. Bill had insisted I be there for what he called a prayer gathering for family restoration. To the outside world, it looked like a father welcoming home a troubled child. To me, it looked like a hunter displaying taxidermy. 20 church elders and major donors filled my living room, sipping sparkling cider and nodding solemnly as Bill spun his narrative of heroic intervention. They stood in clusters, their voices low and reverent, discussing the tragedy of my breakdown and the blessing of family who wouldn't abandon me. I sat on a straight-backed chair in the corner, wearing the plain gray dress Catherine had bought for me. I looked washed out, medicated, defeated. I kept my hands folded in my lap, playing the penitent daughter. Inside, I was recording everything. The small device in my pocket, disguised as an old MP3 player, was capturing every word, every admission, every slip of the mask. Jordan is doing much better, I heard Bill say to Deacon Miller, a man who owned half the car dealerships in the county. It was a near miss, truly, but with the court's help and God's grace, we've taken the burden of her finances off her shoulders. She needs to focus on healing, not spreadsheets. You're a saint, Bill, Miller replied, clapping my father on the back. Most parents would have let her sink. We do what we must for blood, Bill said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. While Bill held court in the living room, Madison was busy in the master bedroom. I could hear her through the baby monitor app I still had access to, the one connected to the smart home system they still didn't know I controlled. Hey guys! Madison's voice came through my earbud, bright and artificial. She was live streaming to her social media followers. So I'm doing a little decluttering today. You know how negative energy can get trapped in old fabrics? I visualized her in my walk-in closet, going through my professional wardrobe, the tailored suits, the crisp white shirts, the clothes I'd carefully selected and maintained over a decade. It's all so drab, Madison told her audience. Gray, black, navy. It's like a prison uniform. We need to inject some life into this space. Speaking of which, look what just arrived. My phone buzzed with a transaction alert. $4,200. Saks Fifth Avenue. I just picked up this little YSL bag, Madison cooed. It's a reward for dealing with so much family drama lately. Self-care is non-negotiable, ladies. I didn't block the transaction. I let the charge clear. Every swipe was a documented instance of misappropriation of conservatorship funds. She wasn't just buying a purse. She was buying herself a felony charge. Enjoy it, Madison, I thought. It'll look great in the evidence locker. I stood up slowly. No one paid attention. I was just furniture now. I walked toward the wet bar where Brandon was stationed, pouring himself another glass of my scotch. Earlier that morning, Frank and I had prepared something special. A manila folder containing 3 sheets of paper designed to look like junk mail or bills. Nothing important. Nothing suspicious. I approached Brandon, keeping my eyes downcast. Hey, Brandon, I said softly. He jumped, splashing scotch onto the granite. Jesus, Jordan, don't sneak up on people. Sorry, I whispered. I found this in the mail stack. It has Madison's name on it, but the last name is different. I thought it might be important. I slid the folder onto the counter next to his drink. Brandon frowned. What are you talking about? It says Madison Lewis, I said innocently. From Ohio. It looks like a court summons or something. I didn't want Dad to see it and get upset. I walked away immediately, retreating to the hallway near the guest bathroom where I had a clear line of sight, but remained in shadow. Brandon stared at the folder. He took a sip of scotch. Then curiosity won out. He flipped it open. I saw his posture change instantly. The first page was a copy of a default judgment from Franklin County Municipal Court. Madison Lewis versus Highland Property Management. Eviction for non-payment. Amount owed, $18,000. The second page was a booking photo. Grainy, but unmistakably Madison. 5 years younger, but the same hard eyes. The third page was a credit report summary. Score, 412. Brandon froze. The scotch glass hovered halfway to his mouth. The illusion of his high-value wife shattered in his hands. He looked at the papers, then toward the bedroom where Madison was still streaming. His face turned a dangerous shade of red, not the flush of alcohol, but the humiliation of a man who realized he'd been played by someone he thought he was using. He slammed the glass down, grabbed the folder, marched toward the master bedroom. I slipped into the guest room next door. The walls were well insulated, but the ventilation system connected the rooms perfectly. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. I also had the baby monitor still active in the master bedroom. Stereo sound. What is this? I heard Brandon yell. The live stream cut off abruptly. Brandon, I'm live. What's wrong with you? I said, what is this? Paper rustled violently. Silence, long and heavy. Where did you get that? Madison's voice dropped an octave. The fake influencer accent was gone. This was the voice of a street fighter from Dayton. Riley gave it to me, Brandon shouted. She found it in the mail. Is this you? Were you evicted? Were you arrested? Lower your voice. Your parents are out there. You told me you had a trust fund. Brandon's voice cracked. You told me you were waiting on an inheritance. I married you because we were supposed to be a power couple. You're broke. You're trash. Oh, I'm trash? Madison laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Look in the mirror, Brandon. You're a 35-year-old man living off Daddy's collection plate. You think I didn't know? Shut up, Brandon warned. No, you shut up. Madison's voice turned venomous. You think you're some big investor? I've seen the transfers, Brandon. I know where the money for your crypto came from. Shepherd's Flock LLC, ring a bell? My thumb hovered over the save button. This was it. I know Bill is skimming off the church charity fund, Madison continued. I traced it weeks ago. Kept my mouth shut because I thought we were partners. I thought we were both hustling to get ahead. But don't you dare stand there and judge me for a few bounced checks when your entire family is laundering money for the Holy Spirit. You knew? Brandon's voice was small now. Of course I knew, Madison scoffed. Why do you think I pushed Bill to do the conservatorship? We needed Jordan's assets to plug the hole before the IRS noticed the charity fund was empty. We're in this together, you idiot. If I go down, I'm taking you and your holy father with me. I hit save, named the file, confession_mutual_destruction.wav, uploaded it immediately to 3 different cloud servers. Madison had just admitted to the conspiracy. She'd admitted to the motive. She'd admitted that the conservatorship was a tool to cover up embezzlement, and she'd done it all within range of a high-fidelity microphone. I walked out of the guest room, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I felt weightless. I returned to the living room. Bill was finishing a toast. "To family," he said, raising his glass. "And to healing." "To healing," the room echoed. I stood by the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Frank Morrison was finalizing the document that would end all of this. I felt a hand on my arm. Tight. Painful. Catherine steered me toward the kitchen, away from the guests. She didn't look like the weeping mother from court. Her eyes were hard and cold. "We need to discuss one more item," Catherine said, pulling a document from her purse. "The lake house. My grandmother's cottage. The only asset I had that wasn't tied to the city, worth maybe $80,000. It was the only place I'd ever felt safe as a child." "What about it?" I asked. "You need to sign it over to Brandon," Catherine said flatly. "Tonight." "Why?" "It's not about the debt," Catherine said, smoothing the paper on the counter. "It's about legacy. Brandon is a man. He needs property in his name. It looks bad for his sister to own the family vacation home while he rents. He has my apartment now." "That's temporary," Catherine dismissed. "The lake house is heritage. He deserves it. He's the firstborn son." I looked at her. "You're taking the last thing I have because he's a boy?" "I'm taking it because he needs it," Catherine snapped. "And you? You don't need it. You're going to be in care. You won't be using it." Then she leaned in close and the mask slipped completely. "Look, Jordan," she whispered, "we both know you're not actually addicted to anything. We know you're lucid." I froze. "You know?" "Of course we know," Catherine hissed. "You're boring, Jordan. You've never touched a drug in your life, but you're stubborn and you're selfish. You refused to help your brother when he was in trouble. You forced us to do this." "You had me declared insane," I said, my voice shaking. "You destroyed my career. You ruined my name. And you knew it was a lie?" "We did what was necessary to stabilize the family," Catherine said, offering me a pen. "You were going to let Brandon be hurt by loan sharks. A good sister would have offered the money. Since you wouldn't offer, we had to take. It's your own fault." She tapped the signature line. "Sign the deed. Give your brother the house. Don't make me call Dr. Caldwell and have him increase your sedation dosage." I looked at the pen. I looked at my mother. The phone in my pocket was still recording. "Just to be clear," I said, speaking slowly and precisely for the microphone. "You know I'm not mentally ill. You know I'm competent, but you're using the court order to force me to give Brandon my property because you think he deserves it more?" "Stop being dramatic and sign," Catherine said. "Yes, we're doing this to fix the balance. Brandon needs this. You exist to support the family. That's your role. Now sign." I picked up the pen. Inside, I was screaming. Screaming for the little girl who'd tried so hard to earn A's just to get a smile from this woman. Screaming for all the years I'd funded their vacations, hoping to buy a scrap of affection. But the auditor in me was calm, satisfied. "Okay, Mom," I said softly. "I understand." I signed away my grandmother's house to the brother who despised me. "Good girl," Catherine said, tucking the paper into her purse. "See? Was that so hard? Now go wash your face. You look depressing." She walked back to the party, smile plastering itself onto her face. I stood in the kitchen alone. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for confessing." I had everything now, the financial trail, Madison admitting to conspiracy, Catherine admitting the conservatorship was perjury and extortion. The party raged on in the living room. Bill's laughter boomed, a man who believed he was untouchable. I walked back out, head bowed, shoulders slumped, took my seat in the corner. Let them have tonight. Let them have the champagne and the sequins and the lake house, because tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the bill would come due, and unlike the dinner at the Gilded Horn, I wasn't going to be the one paying it. Frank Morrison's office smelled of stale coffee and the accumulated dust of 1,000 forgotten lawsuits. It was midnight, and the single lamp on his desk cast long shadows across the whiteboard where he'd been mapping Bill Hayes' psychological weaknesses for the past 3 hours. "Your father has 3 fatal flaws," Frank said, tapping the marker against the board where he'd written 3 words in capital letters: pride, greed, vanity. "First," he continued, circling pride, "he believes he's chosen, anointed. He thinks the rules that bind normal men don't apply to him because he answers to a higher authority. That makes him sloppy." He moved to greed. "Second, he's currently terrified of a loan shark who breaks kneecaps for a living. Panic makes people stupid. He's got 72 hours to come up with $720,000, and he thinks your apartment is his golden ticket." Frank circled vanity twice. "But this is the most important one. Bill is vain in a very specific way. He needs reading glasses, has for 5 years. I used to watch him squint at hymn books, hold contracts at arm's length, but he refuses to wear them in public." "Why?" I asked from my perch on a crate of old case files. "Because he thinks they make him look weak, old, vulnerable." Frank smiled grimly. "Tomorrow, that courtroom will be packed. He's invited his supporters. He wants a show. He'll be so focused on looking like the benevolent patriarch that he won't put on his glasses to read the fine print." "And Walsh?" "Trevor Walsh is a personal injury lawyer who dabbles in family law," Frank said with contempt. "He chases ambulances. He sees a document titled voluntary transfer, and he stops reading. He's lazy, and he thinks he's already won." Frank walked to his desk and picked up the thick blue folder we'd been constructing for the past week. It felt heavy in his hands, not from the weight of paper, but from the weight of what it contained. "This," Frank said reverently, "is a work of art." He opened it to show me the structure. "The front end is soft," he explained, flipping through the first several pages. "It's full of language Bill loves: restoration, stewardship, parental guidance. It strokes his ego. It says you're weak and he's strong. It says you're submitting to his wisdom." Then he flipped to the back, to the appendices we'd spent sleepless nights drafting and redrafting. "But the back end," Frank said, his voice dropping, "is a bear trap with teeth sharp enough to sever bone." He laid out the pages on his desk, pointing to each section with the tip of his pen. "The law requires that a guardian accept the entire estate, assets and liabilities. You cannot cherry pick. If you take the house, you take the mortgage. If you take the business, you take the audit trail. That's non-negotiable." He pointed to Appendix A. "Here we list the Skyline Avenue apartment. Asset value, $650,000. But right underneath, in the encumbrances column, see this language?" I leaned closer. The text was dense, single-spaced, buried in legal terminology. "Attached obligation. Secondary private lien in the amount of $720,000, currently in default status. Guardian assumes full liability for repayment of principal plus interest at 24% APR, compounding monthly." "That's the loan they tried to force you to take out," Frank said. "By accepting the property before that loan is formalized, they're accepting the legal responsibility for the attempted leverage. They're taking ownership of their own extortion scheme." "But that's just a sting," I said. "That won't bring them down." "No," Frank agreed. "That's why we have the kill shot." He pointed to Appendix C. "Asset item number 4, Shepherd's Flock LLC. Classification, family management entity. Condition of transfer. The guardian acknowledges full ownership and control of this entity, including the obligation to provide a source of funds declaration for all deposits exceeding $9,000 made in the fiscal year 2020 to 2024, as required under 31 U.S.C. 5313 and 31 CFR 100 3.22. Source of funds declaration," I repeated slowly. That's the anti-money laundering statute. Exactly. Frank's eyes gleamed. The moment Bill signs this, he's legally declaring that Shepherd's flock is his property. He's taking credit for every dollar inside it, and because we've attached the requirement for a source of funds declaration, he's legally promising the court that he can prove where that money came from. And he can't, I said, because it came from the church charity box. He's signing a confession, Frank confirmed. He thinks he's signing a receipt for a bank account, but he's actually signing an admission to wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Shissa. Frank flipped to another appendix, this one listing Judge Patricia Brennan's campaign fund as a recipient of donations from Blue Harbor Logistics, one of the shell companies. And because Judge Brennan is listed as a beneficiary of that same LLC in the hidden ledgers, Frank said, when she stamps this order, she's unknowingly validating the evidence against herself. She becomes complicit the moment her stamp hits paper. He closed the folder with a soft thud. It's perfect, he said, but the document is only half the battle. The other half is you. Frank pulled a chair closer and sat down, his expression serious. Let's practice, he said. You're on the stand. Judge Brennan asks if you understand what you're doing. What do you say? I straightened my back, started to speak in my normal voice. I've reviewed the documents and… Stop. Frank cut me off. Too smart, too lucid. If you sound like a forensic auditor, Bill will get suspicious. He'll think you're planning something. You need to sound like the daughter he described in the affidavit. You need to sound broken. I slumped my shoulders, let my voice go soft and tremulous. I'm tired of fighting, I whispered, staring at my hands. I just want it to stop. I want my parents to take care of everything. Better, Frank said. But give me the specific line, the one we agreed on. I took a breath, channeled every ounce of exhaustion I'd felt over the past 2 weeks, thought about the humiliation at the restaurant, the invasion of my home, the erasure of my identity. I want to be healed, I said, my voice barely audible. I trust my father. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Perfect, he said. That's the line. I trust my father. Those 4 words will feed his ego so much that he'll sign the paper without even looking at the page numbers. It validates his entire worldview. It tells him he's won. What if Walsh tries to read the appendices? I asked. He might, Frank admitted. Walsh is lazy, but he's not completely incompetent. If he starts reading, if he starts to squint at the liability columns, you look at Bill. Make eye contact. Look pathetic. Bill will shut Walsh down because Bill is the alpha in that relationship. He makes the decisions. Use that against him. And the judge? Frank's expression turned severe. Do not attack Judge Brennan. I know she's corrupt. I know she took bribes, but in that courtroom, she is God. If you challenge her, she'll lock you up for contempt and seal the records. You need to be respectful, submissive. You're not there to win an argument. You're there to get her stamp on that piece of paper. I nodded, absorbing every instruction. Now, Frank said, standing up. The exit strategy. Walk me through it. I pulled a small notebook from my bag. I have a flight booked, 6 p.m. to Chicago. Consultant position with an old colleague at a firm there, off the books for the first month, cash payment. I have a short-term rental in a neighborhood Bill has never heard of, prepaid for 2 months. Money? $5,000 from the burn bag, plus another $4,000 from selling my grandmother's jewelry 3 years ago. I kept it in a safety deposit box under an LLC name. It's not much, but it's enough to survive. It's enough to start over, Frank corrected. Once that gavel drops, you walk out. You don't stay for the fallout. You don't stay to watch the arrests. You disappear. Because when they realize what they've signed, they will come for you, and they will be dangerous. I know. And the coordination with the IRS? Agent David Miller is ready, I said. I sent him the complete evidence package 3 days ago through encrypted email. He has a team on standby. He's just waiting for the filed stamp. The moment the court clerk processes the transfer, it becomes public record. That's the trigger. Frank looked at the clock on his wall. It was nearly 1 a.m. Go to the motel, he said. "Get some sleep. You have a big performance tomorrow." I stood up, picking up my bag, but I paused at the door. "Frank," I said, "why are you helping me? You could have turned me away. You could have stayed hidden." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Church Council Accused of Embezzlement." "5 years ago," Frank said, "I asked Bill to show me the invoices for the roof repair fund. $30,000 had been allocated. I wanted to verify the vendor, make sure we were getting fair pricing. Standard due diligence." He set the clipping on the desk. "The next day, I was accused of soliciting a bribe from the contractor. Bill had a signed statement from a witness who claimed I'd demanded kickbacks. Within a week, I was disbarred. My wife left. My clients abandoned me. Everything I'd built disappeared because I asked to see a receipt." Frank looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "I spent 5 years waiting for someone to care enough to look at the numbers," he said. "You're that someone, Jordan. So, yes, I'm helping you, because watching Bill Hayes realize he's destroyed himself will be the sweetest thing I've tasted in half a decade." I nodded. There was nothing more to say. I left the office and drove back to the motel. The city was quiet, most of Harborstone asleep. I sat in my car for a long time before going to the room, looking at the skyline in the distance. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom and perform the role of my life. I would play the broken daughter, the defeated victim, the incompetent woman who needed saving. And then I would watch my family sign their names to their own destruction. I finally went to the room, laid out the pale beige dress on the chair, the color of surrender. Checked my phone one last time. A text from Brandon. "Don't be late tomorrow, and don't embarrass us." I deleted the thread without responding. I lay down and closed my eyes. I wasn't afraid anymore. I felt a cold, hard resolve settling in my chest like ice. They wanted my possessions. They wanted my autonomy. They wanted my life. Tomorrow, I would give it to them, wrapped in a blue legal folder, and it would be the heaviest thing they ever carried. Deputy Sam Rodriguez called the court to order at exactly 9 o'clock. His voice echoed through courtroom 4 with practiced authority. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Brennan." The air smelled of lemon wood polish and anxiety. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table like a portrait of suffering nobility. Bill wore a dark navy suit that whispered gravitas, the uniform of a man carrying the world's burdens on his shoulders. Catherine was in a muted pastel cardigan, clutching a tissue she hadn't yet used but had positioned prominently in her hand for maximum visibility. Trevor Walsh stood at their table, arranging his papers with theatrical precision. He looked like a magician preparing a trick he'd performed 100 times before. He didn't look at me. I was already a closed file in his mind, a commission check that had cleared. I sat alone at the defense table. My head was down, shoulders slumped forward. I was wearing the beige dress that hung on me like a shroud. I'd deliberately skipped makeup, letting the dark circles under my eyes show. I'd pulled my hair back in a loose, messy knot. I looked exactly like what they wanted to see, a woman who had given up. In the back of the gallery, barely visible in the shadows of the last row, Frank Morrison sat perfectly still. He wore an old blazer, no tie. He looked like a man who'd been defeated by the system years ago. That was the point. Bill needed to see only broken people surrounding me. Judge Patricia Brennan swept into the room, her black robes billowing behind her. She was 61, but looked older, her face etched with the kind of lines that came from too many late nights and too many moral compromises. She looked tired, annoyed, like this hearing was an inconvenience standing between her and her lunch reservation. She glanced at my parents with something that looked like sympathy, or maybe solidarity. Then her eyes found me and her expression hardened into administrative indifference. "We are here on the matter of the emergency conservatorship of Jordan Hayes," Judge Brennan announced, her voice dry as old paper. "Mr. Walsh, you may proceed." Walsh stepped to the podium. He didn't need notes. He'd given this speech before. Different names, same story. "Your Honor," Walsh began, his voice dropping into a somber baritone that would have been impressive if it wasn't so obviously rehearsed. We stand before you today with heavy hearts. Reverend and Mrs. Hayes are pillars of this community. They have spent their lives in service to others, in service to God's work, but they have faced a private tragedy that has tested their faith in ways few can imagine. Bill bowed his head at the word tragedy. Catherine let out a soft, perfectly timed sob that could be heard in the front rows. Their daughter, Jordan, has succumbed to a mental health crisis that has rendered her a danger to herself and her estate, Walsh continued. We have submitted the affidavit from Dr. Richard Caldwell. It details a pattern of paranoia, erratic spending, and substance abuse. Ms. Hayes is a danger to herself. We are asking the court to make the emergency order permanent. We are asking for full guardianship over Ms. Hayes's person and property to protect her from her own self-destruction. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, Judge Brennan said with a gentle nod. She turned to Bill. Reverend Hayes, do you have anything to add? Bill stood up slowly. He didn't go to the podium. He stood right there at the table, gripping its edge as if it were a pulpit, as if he were about to deliver the most important sermon of his life. Your Honor, Bill said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. I don't want to control my daughter. I want to save her. He paused, letting the words settle. I watched her grow up. I watched her shine. She was so bright, so capable, and now, to see her like this, lost, confused, making decisions that put her in danger. He looked directly at me, his eyes glistening with what any observer would believe were tears of genuine concern. Jordan, honey, he said, his voice breaking, we just want you back. We just want to take this burden away so you can rest, so you can heal. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter looked moved. It was a beautiful performance, a masterclass in manipulation. The court appreciates your dedication, Reverend, Judge Brennan said softly. Then she turned to me, her expression cooling. Ms. Hayes, you are unrepresented today. You have filed no countermotions. Do you wish to contest the findings of Dr. Caldwell? Do you wish to speak in your defense? This was the moment. I could feel every eye in the room on me. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I gripped the edge of the table, making my hands tremble slightly. I needed to look like I was struggling to find words, but before I could speak, there was movement in the back of the courtroom. Frank Morrison stood up. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the parquet floor. He looked exactly like what he was, a disgraced lawyer who'd lost everything. His blazer was wrinkled. His shirt was untucked on one side. He looked like he'd crawled out of a bottle to be here. Your Honor, Frank's voice rasped through the quiet room. If it pleases the court. Judge Brennan's eyes widened in recognition. Mr. Morrison, you are not a member of the bar. You have no standing in this courtroom. If you disrupt these proceedings, I will have you removed. I'm not acting as counsel, Your Honor, Frank said, stopping at the railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He held up the thick blue folder we'd prepared. I'm acting as a friend of the respondent. Ms. Hayes asked me to help her understand the paperwork. We're not here to fight. He looked at Bill, then at Walsh. His expression was defeated, resigned. We're here to agree, Frank said quietly. A ripple of shock went through the room. Walsh frowned, looking confused. Bill narrowed his eyes, suddenly alert. Agree? Judge Brennan asked, leaning forward. Ms. Hayes is tired, Frank said, gesturing toward me with the folder. She's exhausted. She accepts the doctor's assessment. She accepts that she needs help. We've prepared a voluntary stipulation of transfer. She's prepared to sign over everything, the apartment, the accounts, the investments. Total control to Reverend and Mrs. Hayes, effective immediately upon the court's stamp. Walsh stepped forward, suspicious now. We already have a temporary order. We don't need a stipulation. The temporary order can be appealed, Frank said smoothly. It can be dragged out in hearings for months, costing your clients time and legal fees. This document, he tapped the blue folder, is a permanent, irrevocable transfer. No appeals, no delays. Your clients get full title to all assets today, right now. He paused, letting the word assets hang in the air like fresh meat before predators. Unless, Frank added, you prefer to spend the next 6 months litigating against a woman who just wants to give up. Judge Brennan looked at the folder. She looked at the clock on the wall. I could see her doing the mental calculation. This was her chance to clear her docket, give Bill what he wanted, and get to her tea time before noon. Ms. Hayes, the judge said, focusing on me. Is this true? Did you authorize Mr. Morrison to draft this agreement? I stood up slowly, kept my hands clasped in front of me to hide the fact that they weren't actually shaking. I looked at Bill. He was watching me with a mixture of hunger and triumph. He thought he'd finally broken me, thought the pressure had been too much. Yes, Your Honor, I said. My voice was quiet, flat, empty. I authorized it. And you understand what this means, Judge Brennan pressed. You are voluntarily stripping yourself of legal autonomy. You are handing over your home, your savings, your financial freedom to your parents. You are declaring yourself incompetent to manage your own affairs. I looked directly at Bill, made sure he could see the defeat in my eyes, the surrender he'd been waiting for. I understand, I said. Then the critical line. I want to be healed. I trust my father. Bill's smile was small but unmistakable. He'd heard what he needed to hear. Submission, validation, victory. Well, Judge Brennan said, leaning back in her chair, that is unexpected, but efficient. Mr. Walsh, review the document. Frank walked over to the plaintiff's table and handed the blue folder to Trevor Walsh. Walsh took it, his expression somewhere between annoyed and relieved. He'd expected a fight. This easy capitulation felt like a gift. He opened the folder and started reading the first page. Seems standard, Walsh muttered to Bill. Boilerplate language citing the incapacity statute under Section 5901. He flipped to the second page, then the third. His finger traced down the paragraphs, his lips moving slightly as he read the dense legal text. Then he reached the appendices, the asset schedules, the liability columns. Walsh squinted at the small print, his brow furrowed. Wait, Walsh said, flipping back and forth between pages. There are attached notes here regarding corporate entities, some complex language about tax obligations. I need time to parse this, specifically regarding the... Bill stood up abruptly. He walked over to Walsh and put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly but carried the weight of command. Trevor, Bill said, his voice jovial but with an edge underneath. It's fine. It's just lawyer jargon. You heard the girl. She trusts me. She's giving us the assets. But Reverend, Walsh whispered, trying to keep his voice down, I haven't verified the liabilities column. There are references here to corporate structures that need review. We should take this back to the office and wait another week? Bill hissed. The joviality vanished from his voice. The loan is due in 24 hours, Trevor. I need that signature now. If we leave here without the order, I can't access the funds to pay. He stopped himself, realizing his voice had risen. He glanced at the judge, then back at Walsh. I need this today, Bill said more quietly. Do you want to explain to loan sharks that we were delayed by paperwork? Do you want that on your conscience? Walsh looked at the folder again. He saw the company names listed in Appendix C, Shepherd's Flock LLC, Pierce Heritage Holdings. He saw words that looked like assets, like money, like the solution to all of Bill's problems. He didn't see the fine print next to them, the obligations, the admissions, the trap, and Bill, standing over him, didn't put on his reading glasses to check. He was too vain, too proud, too desperate. Give me the pen, Bill commanded. Reverend, I strongly advise against signing without... I said give me the pen, Bill snapped. Walsh hesitated, then pulled a pen from his jacket pocket. He held it out. Bill snatched it from his hand. He looked up at Judge Brennan. Your Honor, Bill announced, his voice ringing with confidence. We are ready to accept this responsibility. We are ready to bring our daughter home. He bent down and signed his name with a flourish. Big, bold letters that took up 3 lines. William Hayes. He handed the pen to Catherine. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, looking at me. I offered her a weak, sad smile. the smile of a daughter who had finally learned her place. Catherine took the pen and signed, Catherine Hayes. Brandon needs to sign for the corporate officer transfer, Frank said from the side of the courtroom. His voice was helpful, accommodating. Since he's listed as a managing officer on the LLC. Brandon, who'd been sitting behind them in the gallery, jumped up eagerly. He walked to the table and signed his name quickly, barely glancing at the document. He was thinking about his inheritance, about the lake house, about the money that would finally solve all his problems. Brandon Hayes. It's done, Bill said, handing the folder up to Judge Brennan's bench with both hands, like a sacred offering. Judge Brennan took it. She flipped through the first few pages, the ones with big headers and clear language. She didn't read the appendices. Why would she? The parties had agreed. The famous Reverend Hayes had signed. It was a done deal. She raised her heavy wooden stamp, the one that transformed documents into legally binding orders. Approved, Judge Brennan declared. Thud. The stamp hit the paper with a sound that seemed to echo through the room. The court accepts the voluntary stipulation, Judge Brennan ruled. Guardianship is granted. Assets are transferred effective immediately. She looked at Deputy Rodriguez, who was standing near the court reporter's station. Deputy, Judge Brennan said, please read the inventory of transferred assets into the record so we can close this file. This was standard procedure, a boring formality. Usually, it was a short list, a bank account, a car, some furniture. The deputy would read it in a monotone. The transcript would be filed and everyone would go home. Deputy Rodriguez picked up the folder. He walked to the center of the courtroom, cleared his throat. Inventory of assets and obligations accepted by William and Catherine Hayes, Rodriguez read, his voice flat and professional. Bill was already relaxing in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks. The hard part was over. Now came the easy part, liquidating my life. Item 1, Rodriguez announced. Residential condominium located at 402 Skyline Avenue. Asset value, $650,000. Bill smiled. That was the prize. That was the apartment that would solve everything. Attached obligation, Rodriguez continued without pausing. Secondary predatory lien in the amount of $720,000 currently in default status. Guardian assumes full liability for repayment of principal and interest. Bill's smile froze on his face. His hand stopped mid-adjustment of his cufflink. What? He whispered. That's the loan we were going to take out. That's not... Guardian assumes liability, Rodriguez repeated, reading from the document. Item 2. Catherine leaned forward. This was supposed to be the money, the trust fund, the liquid assets. Pierce Solvency Trust, Rodriguez read. Asset value, $200,000. Catherine's hand went to her chest. This was it. This was... Attached obligation, Rodriguez continued. Retroactive tax penalty for unreported income in the amount of $214,000 payable immediately to the Internal Revenue Service. Guardian assumes full liability for payment. Catherine gasped. The sound was raw, genuine, not the practiced sob from earlier. 200,000? She hissed at Walsh. Trevor, what is he reading? Walsh was frantically flipping through his copy of the document, his finger racing down the pages he hadn't read carefully enough. I told you to let me read it, Walsh muttered, his face going pale. I told you. Sit down, Mr. Walsh, Judge Brennan snapped. Her voice had lost its earlier warmth. The inventory was signed by your clients. Deputy, continue. Rodriguez turned the page. His voice was getting louder now, as if he was beginning to realize what he was reading. Item 3, he said. Item 3, Deputy Rodriguez repeated, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent courtroom. The entity known as Shepherd's Flock, LLC. Judge Patricia Brennan sat up straight, the color drained from her face in a visible wave, starting at her forehead and spreading down to her neck. She knew that name. She knew it intimately. Asset transferred to Guardian Control, Rodriguez read, his eyes widening as he processed the words. Attached obligation. The guardian acknowledges full ownership of all transaction history and assumes liability for source of funds declaration regarding all deposits between 2020 and 2024. Bill was standing now, his chair scraping back. Stop! That's not. I didn't agree to. You signed it, sir, Rodriguez said, looking up at him. Your signature is on page 7. Rodriguez looked back down at the document and continued reading. Notable entries in the ledger include transfers to Campaign Fund C and Judicial Re-Election Committee via shell entity Blue Harbor Logistics. Stop! Judge Brennan screamed. The word came out raw, terrified, her carefully maintained judicial composure shattering like glass. She stood up so fast her chair crashed against the wall behind her. Deputy, stop reading immediately! Rodriguez looked confused. I'm reading the approved order into the record, Your Honor. That's standard procedure for— I said stop! Judge Brennan grabbed her gavel and slammed it down, not with measured authority, but with genuine panic. The sound was explosive. Bang! The wooden block splintered, cracking down the middle. Clear the court! Brennan shrieked, her voice breaking. Bailiff, seize that document! I want these records sealed immediately. This is— someone call security! But it was too late. The court reporter had typed every word. The few people in the gallery, church elders, curious lawyers waiting for other cases, had heard it all. The transcript was already in the system, time-stamped and logged. And most importantly, Rodriguez hadn't stopped reading. He was a man who followed procedure, and the procedure was clear. Read the full inventory into the record. Item 4, Rodriguez continued, speaking faster now, trying to finish before someone physically stopped him. Outstanding civil fraud judgments against Madison Pierce, alias Madison Lewis, assumed by the estate. Item 5. Madison Lewis? Brandon shouted from his seat. His face had gone from confusion to horror. You put her debts on my parents? Silence in my courtroom! Brennan screamed, but her voice had lost all authority. She sounded hysterical now, and then the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. It wasn't the public. It wasn't the press. 3 men in navy windbreakers walked in with the calm, measured steps of people who knew they were in complete control. On the back of their jackets, in bright yellow letters, IRS, CI, Criminal Investigation. Agent David Miller was in the lead. I recognized him from the photo he'd sent in his encrypted reply to my email. He was mid-40s, with the kind of face that had seen too many white-collar criminals think they were smarter than everyone else. He walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the judge's screaming, ignoring the bailiff who was moving to intercept him. He walked directly to the plaintiff's table where Bill was standing, trembling with rage and confusion. Agent Miller held up a piece of paper. It wasn't a court order. It was an indictment. William Hayes, Miller said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Based on the sworn admission of ownership you just signed and filed with this court, you are under arrest for tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering under Title 18, United States Code. Bill stared at the agent, then at the blue folder on the judge's bench, then at me. I wasn't looking down anymore. I wasn't slumping. I stood tall, my spine straight, my face calm. I looked him right in the eye. I trusted you, Dad, I said quietly, but in the stunned silence of the courtroom, my voice carried perfectly. I trusted you to take exactly what you deserved. This is a mistake, Bill's voice boomed, falling back on his pulpit authority. I am Reverend William Hayes. I serve this community. You signed a document claiming ownership of a shell corporation used to launder embezzled funds, Miller said, completely unfazed. You provided a detailed list of transactions. You acknowledged liability for tax fraud. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. I didn't read it, Bill shouted, panic replacing authority. My lawyer told me to sign. My daughter tricked me. This is— Ignorance of the text is not a defense for a signature, sir, Miller said. Turn around. Bill looked at the gallery, searching for a friendly face. The church elders he'd invited were shrinking back, terrified of being associated with the disaster unfolding before them. Do not touch me, Bill snarled, pulling his arm away as Miller reached for him. I am a man of God! Today, you're a man under arrest, Miller said. With a practiced motion, he spun Bill around. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp, metallic, final. Click, click. Catherine let out a genuine scream, not a performance sob, but raw terror. Another agent stepped forward, addressing Brandon. Brandon Hayes? You signed as managing officer of the LLC. That makes you an executive in charge of the laundering operation. You're also under arrest. No! Brandon's voice cracked. I just wanted the lake house. Mom said I get the lake house. I didn't do anything. You signed the corporate resolution, the agent said, pulling out handcuffs. That makes you legally responsible for the placement and layering of illicit funds. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. Brandon collapsed. His legs simply gave out, and he crumpled to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The agent hauled him back up, none too gently, and cuffed his hands behind his back. Catherine grabbed my arm, her nails digging in, desperate. Jordan, she whispered frantically. Jordan, tell them this is a misunderstanding. You're the auditor. You can fix this. Talk to the agents. Explain that your father is a good man. I looked down at her hand, at the diamond ring on her finger, the one bought with money stolen from the soup kitchen fund. I gently peeled her fingers off my arm. You wanted control, Mom, I said softly. You told the court I was incompetent. You told the world I couldn't manage my own life. You fought to take over my responsibilities. I stepped back, putting distance between us. Well, I said, you have them. You have the assets. You have the liabilities. You have the consequences. All of them. You ungrateful little... Catherine's face twisted into something ugly. All pretense of maternal concern gone. After everything we did for you... Mrs. Hayes, a female agent said, stepping between us. You're also listed as a signatory on joint tax returns for the last 5 years. We have questions regarding unreported income. You need to come with us. Catherine's hand went to her chest. She looked around desperately for someone to save her, but there was no one. Bill was already being led toward the side door, his head bowed. Brandon was weeping openly, mumbling incoherently about algorithms and lake homes. Across the room, Madison was trying to melt into the woodwork near the exit. She'd backed up against the wall, clutching her new YSL bag like a shield, trying to be invisible. Ms. Pierce? Agent Miller called out without even turning his head. Or should I say, Ms. Lewis? Madison froze, her hand on the door handle. I'm just a witness, Madison said quickly, putting on her most innocent voice. I didn't sign anything. I don't know anything about their business. We have the audio, Madison, I said clearly. Everyone looked at me. We have the recording from 3 nights ago, I continued, speaking directly to her. The one where you admitted to tracing the funds. The one where you admitted to pushing for the conservatorship to cover up the theft. The one where you admitted to conspiracy. Madison's face went gray. You recorded me? That's illegal. That's invasion of privacy. Recorded in my home, I said calmly. The home you were occupying, and since I was the legal owner at the time, I consented to the recording. One-party consent, admissible in federal court. Agent Miller signaled to the officer at the door. Accessory to wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and obstruction. Also, the state of Ohio has an outstanding warrant for check fraud. Take her! Madison screamed, not a scream of fear, but of pure, entitled rage. She kicked as the officer grabbed her, her expensive handbag falling to the floor and spilling its contents. Lipstick, credit cards, a checkbook from an account that didn't exist. Judge Brennan, Agent Miller said, finally addressing the bench. We'll need to secure all exhibits, including the document you just stamped. Brennan was shaking. She looked at the agent, then at the empty plaintiff's table, then at me. She realized that if she let the order stand, she was legally affirming a transfer of criminal assets that implicated her own campaign. She needed to distance herself, needed to cut the cord before she went down with them. She grabbed what remained of her broken gavel. In light of... Her voice shook. In light of new evidence presented by federal authorities, the court finds that the basis for the emergency conservatorship was fraudulent. She banged the splintered gavel. The affidavit of Dr. Richard Caldwell is hereby struck from the record. Bang! The order of guardianship is vacated. The transfer of assets is nullified due to bad faith. Ms. Hayes's legal capacity is restored in full, effective, immediately. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, begging me to understand that she was trying to save herself. But the nullification didn't matter to the agents. The crime wasn't the possession of the assets. The crime was the intent. Bill and Brandon had signed papers claiming ownership. That signature was the confession. The fact that the judge panicked and canceled the deal 5 minutes later didn't change what they'd tried to do. "Court is adjourned," Brennan announced, then practically ran toward her chambers. They led Bill past me. He stopped for just a second, the agents allowing it. He looked at me. Really looked at me for maybe the first time in years. There was no anger in his eyes, just profound confusion. He couldn't understand how the world had flipped so quickly. "I'm your father," he whispered. "I know," I said. "That's why I knew you wouldn't read the fine print." They took him away. They took Brandon, who was still weeping. They took Catherine, who was muttering about betrayal. They took Madison, who was cursing about her handbag. The room emptied. The gallery cleared. The noise faded to nothing. Frank walked down the aisle from the back row. He stood next to me, and together we looked at the empty table where my parents had sat just minutes before. "You did it," Frank said quietly. "You took them all down in one morning." "I didn't do it," I said, picking up my bag. "They did it. They built the bomb. I just handed them the match." I looked around the courtroom one last time. It didn't look scary anymore. It just looked like a room full of wood and old decisions. "What now?" Frank asked. "Want to file for the apartment back? Judge vacated the order. You legally own it again." I thought about the apartment, about Madison's muddy boots on my white rug, about Brandon's wine stains on my sofa, about the air thick with their greed. "No," I said. "Let the bank foreclose. Let the IRS seize it for the tax lien. I don't want it." "You're walking away with nothing." "I'm walking away with my name," I said. "With my freedom. That's worth more than a condo on Skyline Avenue." I pulled out my plane ticket to Chicago, showed it to Frank. "I have a flight to catch." Frank smiled, genuine and warm, the first real smile I'd seen on his face in the week we'd worked together. He extended his hand. "Good luck, Jordan. If you ever need a lawyer in a dark alley—" "I'll call you," I said, shaking his hand firmly. I turned and walked toward the heavy double doors, pushed them open. The hallway air was cooler. I walked past the security checkpoint, past the metal detectors, out onto the front steps of the courthouse. The sun was high in the sky, bright and clear. The city of Harborstone bustled on, completely unaware that its most prominent family had just been erased. I didn't look back. I walked down the steps to the sidewalk, hailed a cab. "O'Hare Airport," I told the driver. As the car pulled away, merging into traffic, I looked at my reflection in the window. I saw a woman who'd been stripped of everything, and somehow came out richer. The studio apartment in Chicago was small, 600 square feet of temporary furnished anonymity in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. It had a Murphy bed, a kitchenette, and a window that overlooked a brick wall. It was nothing like my apartment on Skyline Avenue. It was perfect. 72 hours after the courthouse implosion, I sat on the lumpy sofa with a mug of cheap coffee, watching the news on my laptop. "Harborstone pastor arrested in massive fraud scheme." The local news anchor spoke with the barely concealed excitement of someone who'd just gotten the story of their career. Behind her, footage rolled, Bill being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, his suit jacket draped over his wrists in a futile attempt at dignity. Catherine, her face hidden behind her hands. Brandon stumbling, supported by 2 federal agents. Reverend William Hayes and 3 family members face federal charges in what prosecutors are calling a sophisticated money laundering operation, the anchor reported. Allegations include embezzling over $1.2 million from church charity funds over a 4-year period. The screen cut to mugshots. Bill looked smaller in his booking photo, stripped of his pastoral robes, his expensive suit, his carefully maintained image. He looked like what he was, a criminal. Catherine's photo showed her mid-sob, mascara running. Brandon's eyes were vacant, shocked. Madison's was the only one where she stared directly at the camera, defiant to the end. The coverage shifted to interviews with church congregation members, filmed outside the now padlocked Harborstone Community Church. "I'm shocked," an elderly woman said, clutching her Bible. "Betrayed. We trusted him with our offerings. We thought it was going to feed the hungry." "My mother gave her last $50 to that charity fund," a younger man said, anger tightening his voice. "She skipped her medication so she could donate, and he was using it to gamble?" The anchor continued. "Judge Patricia Brennan has recused herself from all pending cases and faces a separate ethics investigation by the state bar. Sources say she may face her own charges of corruption and accepting illegal campaign contributions." I turned down the volume as my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I'd been getting calls nonstop, reporters who'd somehow tracked down my new number, distant relatives suddenly concerned about my well-being, even a book agent asking if I'd considered writing a memoir. I ignored them all except for two. The first was Agent David Miller. "Ms. Hayes, this is Agent Miller, IRSCI. We'll need you as a witness for the grand jury proceedings. We can arrange closed-circuit testimony to protect your identity. Please call me back at this number." I saved his contact and replied with a brief text. "Available to testify. Will cooperate fully." The second was from Frank Morrison. "Congratulations on your victory. Bill's refusing plea deal, going to trial. Catherine and Brandon cooperating against him in Madison in exchange for reduced sentences. Trial set for 8 months from now. You'll need to testify. F." I stared at that message for a long time. Bill was refusing a plea. That meant he still believed he could win, could spin this, could convince a jury that he was the victim of a vindictive daughter's elaborate frame job. Good. Let him try to explain his signature on those documents in front of 12 citizens and a federal judge. My phone rang, a number I recognized. I answered. "Jordan Hayes." "Ms. Hayes, this is Patricia Chin from Midwest Forensics and Audit." The voice was professional, warm. "We received your application and were impressed by your credentials. Despite the circumstances of your departure from Caldwell and Finch, your former senior partner gave you a glowing recommendation. Are you available for an interview next week?" I sat up straighter. "Yes, absolutely." "Excellent. How does Tuesday at 10 work for you?" "Perfect." When I hung up, I realized I was smiling. A real smile, not the careful performance I'd worn for so long in Harborstone. I had walked away from everything, and everything was starting to walk toward me. 8 months later, Federal Courthouse, Chicago. The video conference screen showed a federal courtroom in Harborstone. I was testifying via secure closed-circuit feed from a witness room in Chicago, a small protection agent Miller had negotiated to keep my location private. On the screen, I could see Bill sitting at the defense table. He'd aged a decade in 8 months. His hair had gone completely gray. His suit hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight. But his eyes still burned with that same righteous indignation, the belief that he was the persecuted saint, not the fallen sinner. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Janet Kowalski, stood at the podium. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice clear through the speakers, "can you explain to the jury the document your father signed on that morning in Judge Brennan's courtroom?" I kept my voice level, professional. This wasn't about emotion. This was about facts. The document was a voluntary transfer agreement with a detailed asset schedule attached as Appendix C, I said. The appendix contained a complete listing of shell corporations: Shepherd's Flock LLC, Trinity Services, Blue Harbor Logistics, along with their transaction histories. And by signing this document, what did the defendant legally acknowledge? He acknowledged ownership and control of those entities, I said. Under federal law, specifically 31 U.S.C. 5313, anyone accepting ownership of a financial entity must be able to provide source of funds declarations for large transactions. By signing, my father took legal responsibility for every dollar that passed through those accounts. And could he provide those declarations? No, because the money came from the Harborstone Community Church Pastoral Discretionary Fund, a charity account he had embezzled from. Bill's defense attorney, an expensive lawyer from a firm in Detroit, stood up for cross-examination. He was younger than Walsh, sharper, but he had the same problem. His client had signed a confession. "Miss Hayes," the defense attorney said, his tone dripping with accusation. "Isn't it true that you created this document specifically to trick your father?" "I created a document that accurately listed all assets and liabilities," I said calmly. "My father chose to sign it without reading it. That's not trickery, that's negligence." "But you knew he wouldn't read it carefully, didn't you?" "I knew my father was greedy. I knew he was arrogant. I knew he would see dollar signs and stop thinking." I paused. "But those are character traits, not legal defenses. The law requires due diligence. My father had a fiduciary responsibility to review documents before signing them. He chose not to. That's not my fault. That's his." "Your Honor," the defense attorney appealed to the judge, "the witness is clearly hostile toward my client." "The witness is clearly honest," Judge Maria Torres interrupted. She was a federal judge with a reputation for intolerance of white-collar crime. "And her testimony is corroborated by your client's signature on a document he now claims he didn't read. Continue, Ms. Hayes." The cross-examination went on for another hour, but it didn't matter. The prosecutor had the signed documents, had the bank records, had the testimony from church members about missing charity funds, had Catherine's and Brandon's cooperation, both of them testifying against Bill in exchange for reduced sentences. And most damaging of all, they had Bill's own words recorded at the courthouse. "I need that signature now. I need to access the funds." His own desperation had become evidence of consciousness of guilt. 3 weeks later, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. I watched the verdict via the same video feed, Frank Morrison sitting next to me in the Chicago witness room. The foreperson stood. "On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant William Hayes guilty." Bill's face didn't change. He stared straight ahead. "On the count of money laundering, guilty." "On the count of tax evasion, guilty." "On the count of embezzlement of charitable funds, guilty." All 18 counts. Guilty on every single one. Judge Torres's sentencing was swift and severe. "Mr. Hayes, you exploited the trust of your congregation. You stole from the poor to fund a lifestyle of deception. You corrupted your family and attempted to destroy your daughter when she refused to enable your crimes." She looked at him over her glasses. "The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving 12 years. You will also make full restitution to the Harborstone Community Church in the amount of $1.3 million. Catherine had already been sentenced, 5 years, eligible for parole after 3, for her role as an accessory and for signing false tax returns. The judge had been slightly more lenient given her cooperation. Brandon received 8 years. He'd cooperated, turned over his gambling records, testified about how Bill had recruited him to move the money. But he'd still actively participated, still signed corporate documents, still benefited from the scheme. Madison Lewis, her real name restored in the court records, received 7 years plus restitution to her Ohio victims. She'd refused to cooperate, maintained her innocence to the end, claimed she'd been manipulated by Bill. The jury hadn't believed her, especially after they heard the audio recording of her admitting to the conspiracy. Judge Patricia Brennan was disbarred and forced to resign. She avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators and revealing the full extent of the campaign finance scheme. Her career was over, but she stayed out of prison. Trevor Walsh, the lazy lawyer who hadn't read the documents, was suspended from practicing law for 2 years for negligence and failing to meet professional standards. Dr. Richard Caldwell, who'd signed the false affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent, lost his medical license permanently. The ripple effects spread outward. The Harborstone Community Church dissolved, its assets sold and distributed to actual charities. The building became a community center. Some congregation members started a new, smaller church with transparent accounting and independent oversight. $800,000 was recovered from various accounts and returned to the charity fund, distributed to the families and causes that should have received it years ago. Midwest Forensics and Audit Chicago Senior Forensic Auditor Jordan Hayes. The brass nameplate on my office door still gave me a small thrill every time I saw it. The office was modest, a corner space with windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a clean desk, walls lined with certifications and case commendations. I'd been with the firm for 11 months. In that time, I'd led investigations into 3 major fraud cases, recovered over $40 million in misappropriated funds, and built a reputation as someone who found what others missed. I'd also started teaching a course at Northwestern's business school, Forensic Accounting, Reading What Others Don't Write. It was well attended, popular with students who understood that the real power in the business world came from understanding the fine print. My phone rang. Frank Morrison. "Just got word," Frank said without preamble. "Bill's appeal was denied. He's going to serve the full sentence, minimum 12 years before parole consideration." I leaned back in my chair. "How do you feel?" "Vindicated," Frank said simply. "Justice for what he did to me 5 years ago. Justice for what he did to you. Justice for all those people who trusted him." There was a pause. "How about you?" Frank asked. "Any regrets?" I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, thought about the question carefully. "I thought I'd feel triumphant," I said slowly. "Victorious. Like I'd won something. And mostly I feel free," I said. Free from the weight of being their emotional bank account. Free from the delusion that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, they'd finally love me. I picked up a photo on my desk, one I'd taken last weekend at a work gathering. Me and my new team, laughing at someone's terrible joke. Real smiles. Real friendships built on mutual respect, not obligation or blood. "They taught me that family is supposed to be unconditional," I continued. "They were right. My freedom from them is unconditional too." "You saved yourself, Jordan," Frank said quietly. "That's the ultimate win." After we hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet office. Then I turned back to my desk. A new case file sat there, flagged as urgent by the senior partner. A manufacturing company, suspicious transactions, a CFO who'd been with the company for 20 years and had everyone's trust. I opened the file and began reading. Financial statements, bank records, corporate minutes. Looking for the patterns that others had missed. Looking for the truth hidden in the numbers. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my students. "Professor Hayes, just got my first job offer. They want me to start in their forensic accounting division. Thank you for teaching us to look beyond the obvious. Emma." I smiled and typed back. "Congratulations. Remember, the fine print always matters. Read everything twice." I returned to the case file, highlighter in hand. As I worked, I found myself thinking about that morning in the courthouse. The sound of Bill's handcuffs clicking shut. The look of confusion on his face when he finally understood what he'd signed. People asked me sometimes if I felt guilty, if I felt bad about destroying my family. The answer was always the same. I didn't destroy them. I just made them read what they'd written. 2 years after the trial, the email notification popped up on my screen during my morning coffee routine. It was from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. "Inmate William Hayes, registration number 47392-019, has requested to add you to his approved correspondence list. Do you approve this request?" My finger hovered over the mouse. I thought about Bill sitting in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits. No congregation to preach to, no image to maintain. I clicked deny. I'd said everything I needed to say to him in that courtroom 2 years ago. There was nothing left to discuss. My phone rang, the office line. "Jordan Hayes." "Ms. Hayes, this is Marcus Webb from the Securities and Exchange Commission." The voice was professional, urgent. "We have a situation involving a cryptocurrency trading platform that's potentially defrauded thousands of investors. The scheme is sophisticated, multi-layered shell corporations, offshore accounts. We need someone who specializes in complex financial forensics. Your name came highly recommended." I pulled up a blank document on my screen, fingers already moving to take notes. "Tell me about the structure," I said. As Webb outlined the case, millions of dollars, hundreds of victims, a scheme that had been running for 3 years. I felt that familiar clarity settling over me, the same clarity I'd felt in my car after walking out of the Gilded Horn, the same clarity I'd felt sitting in that motel room, watching my family commit crimes on my laptop. This was what I did. This was who I was. Not Bill Hayes's daughter, not the family scapegoat, not the victim. I was Jordan Hayes, forensic auditor. I found the truth that people tried to hide. I read the fine print that others ignored. I followed the money until it had nowhere left to run. Send me everything you have, I told Webb. Bank statements, corporate filings, transaction logs. I'll need full access to your evidence servers. You'll have it within the hour. After I hung up, I stood and walked to the window. The Chicago skyline stretched out before me, glass and steel towers catching the morning sun. Somewhere in one of those buildings, someone was hiding money, lying on documents, thinking they were smarter than everyone else. They weren't. I'd learned from the best liars I'd ever known, and I'd learned how to beat them at their own game. My desk phone rang again. I glanced at the caller ID, Frank Morrison. "Let me guess," I said, answering. "You saw the news about the crypto case." "Sounds like your specialty," Frank said. "Need a consultant?" "Thought you were retired." I was, but then I realized retirement is boring. I heard the smile in his voice. "Besides, someone needs to teach these white-collar criminals that the law isn't a suggestion." "I'll send you the files," I said. "But Frank, we do this by the book. No shortcuts." "Wouldn't have it any other way." After we hung up, I pulled the new case file onto my screen, started building my spreadsheet, my timeline, my map of lies. 3 years ago, I'd been sitting in a courtroom watching my father destroy himself with his own signature. 2 years ago, I'd walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a plane ticket and a determination to rebuild. Now I had a career I loved, a team I respected, a purpose that went beyond survival. I'd learned something that Bill never understood. The fine print doesn't just matter in contracts and court documents. It matters in every choice you make, every relationship you build, every line you draw. My family taught me that love could be conditional, that loyalty could be weaponized, that blood could be a chain instead of a bond. But they also taught me, inadvertently, ironically, the most valuable lesson of my life. Always read the fine print. Always know what you're signing. Always understand the cost before you agree to pay. I opened the new case file, picked up my coffee, and got to work. Somewhere out there, a criminal thought they'd hidden their tracks well enough. Thought they'd been clever enough. Thought no one would look closely enough to see the truth. They were wrong. Because I always read the fine print, and I was very good at my job.